Technology mean again? The study of knowledge. And so we're asking, we're kind of looking at what are the sources of knowledge? How do we come to know things? And there's a lot of, there's a history of philosophers kind of debating this. And it took me a long time to be able to sort this out. So I'm going to put on a chart that we're going to go through, which is by trying to sort this out to understand this the best that I could. So there are people, you should know, that they basically break into two camps, empiricists and rationalists. And we're going to look at what they believe. So we start off, we can say there's two main sources of knowledge that people say. There's experience, which everybody agrees is the biggest source of our knowledge. But there's also our reasoning ability, and we're going to later talk about that we may actually be born with some knowledge. It may be innate. Okay, so everybody agrees, and we've talked about this. How do you know things? Well, it's through your senses, which means you're getting experience. That's how you come to know things. And that kind of knowledge is called a posteriori, if you're an empiricist. What does a posteriori mean? It means you have not, you can see post means afterwards, right? So knowledge only comes after experience. You have to have experience before you can really know anything, okay? So the empiricists believe the only kind of knowledge that we get, it all starts with experience. However, they do think there is a second kind of knowledge beyond that with experience. They agree that our reasoning ability can be applied to what we already have experienced to extend our knowledge. This is still a posteriori knowledge because it's applied, you first start with experience, then you use your reasoning ability to extend it. So as I recall, Hume gives the following example. Hume says, your friend tells you he's going to go to France, and then a week, he tells you he's going for a couple of weeks, and then a week later you knock on his door and he doesn't answer, and he says, oh, I forgot, he's in France. So you conclude he's in France. Now, have you experienced him actually being in France? You haven't, but you did get the experience of him telling you he was going. You also have the experience of knocking on his door and is not answering. And then you apply your reasoning ability to those two things, and you extend kind of your knowledge to conclude, oh, we must still be in France. So we still started with our experiences, but then we used our reasoning ability to make a conclusion that is beyond our immediate experience. You see how that works? So it's still, this still started with experience. Now the empiricists believe this is the only way we get to know things. It all starts with our senses. It all starts with experience, but we do apply our reasoning ability to extend that knowledge. The rationalists believe there are one or more sources of knowledge that are actually independent of experience. So, so the first one we can say is using our reasoning ability independent of experience, but we're going to say it's not innate. Innate just means you're born with it. And what would that be? Well, maybe a possibility would be something like higher math. I don't think you're born with the understanding of higher math, but the argument is math isn't necessarily based on experience. You kind of play with these numbers and you can figure it out, and you get knowledge, and you can see how calculus works or algebra works. So that's a possibility. Now, I will tell you, there's debates among philosophers. Some would say, well, even math is still based on experience, but I don't want to get into the debate. I just want to show you kind of what philosophers are debating about. So some people would say that using our reasoning ability can lead us to knowledge totally independent of our experiences in the world. If that's true, that's a different kind of knowledge. We call that a priori. Priori just means we can have some knowledge prior to experience. Again, priori, prior. Some knowledge, maybe I should write that down. Some knowledge is prior to experience. Okay, knowledge prior to experience. Now, there is a different way we may have knowledge prior to experience besides using our reasoning ability, The idea is maybe we were just born with it. Innate means we're just born with it. It's just in our genetics to know certain things. So we can think of a few possible examples of things that may be innate. Let's just say, I'm going to put here an infant breastfeeding. For a lot of infants, they don't have to be taught. Actually, some actually do, believe it or not. But for a lot of infants, they don't have to be taught. They come out and they know they'll get nutrition by going, for the woman's breast. It just seems like it's in their genetics. They come out, they know how to do that. They don't actually have to be taught. They don't have to have any experience in doing it. They already know it. We can always think of things like birds. Do birds have to be actually taught to fly south for the winter? It doesn't seem like it. It seems like they already know to do it. It's just something, in their genes, in genetics. Some people would say that basic math, we're just known. So for example, a kid, when they look, they can just, as soon as their vision is okay, they can recognize there's two objects as opposed to one, and that two is more than one. That's kind of basic math, right? Or they can see there's three objects, and that's more than one object. So some kind of basic math, you might say, is just innate. We just kind of know that. Probably some animals do too. Some philosophers have actually argued that the belief in God is innate. We're born with the belief in God. If you believe that would also be innate. I don't actually think that's true, but some philosophers have argued for that position. Again, if it's innate, it's a priori knowledge. So a priori again means that you have some knowledge before you actually have experiences about the world, before your sense experiences actually kick in. It's not dependent on it. So we call these people that believe in either the three or four of these sources of knowledge, they would be rationalists. Because the empiricists believe all knowledge starts with sense experience, and remember, it includes our reasoning ability when it's applied to our prior sense experience. But the rationalists say, no, there's two other sources of knowledge. We have some knowledge totally independent of experience, or some knowledge that we're actually born with that's in our genes. Now, we should also be very clear. Rationalists accept the first two types. In other words, they accept that we get knowledge from experience, and our reasoning is applied to our experience and expands it. So we can say the rationalists accept all, 1, 2, 3, and 4. The empiricists only accept 1 and 2. So what are the rationalists? What's the view of rationalism? Some knowledge is independent of experience. What kind? If it's either we're born with it, or there just seems to be other kinds that maybe we can just reason our way to the knowledge, and it's independent of experience. Now, we might say, all right, well, which one of these is actually right? I mean, I guess technically, I would think rationalism is right in the sense that I do think we're born with some knowledge. It seems like some knowledge is in our genetics. Not a lot, but we're born with a little bit. I'm not sure I agree with this third one. I'm just not really sure about it. With 4, I'm pretty sure that we have some knowledge we're born with before experience, but it's not a whole heck of a lot. And so I think the empiricists are almost right. It sounds funny, even though I guess rationalism is technically right, because I still think almost all of our knowledge does start with experience. In fact, when we look at philosophy, there's a lot of confusion about even if you talk, is a certain philosopher an empiricist or a rationalist? Because we can take Kant. Kant, we studied Kant earlier in the course about his ethics. But he's usually associated with rationalism, and yet he clearly makes a statement that all knowledge starts with experience, which actually, if he really is going to be solid with that, then he would be an empiricist. So, and Descartes, there's confusion, because Descartes makes a lot of statements that makes him sound like an empiricist, but then it seems that he may believe in God, and he may think it's an innate belief. So, it's very muddled, this area, like who's really an empiricist and who's a rationalist, and exactly what's right. I think we can say this. It seems to be there's 3 big sources of knowledge. The biggest source is our experiences. That's how we kind of know. Our senses are our windows to the world. That's how we kind of know things are out there. That's certainly the major area. A smaller area is our reasoning ability. It does seem to be able to extend our knowledge beyond our experience to some extent. And it does seem like even infants have a little bit of knowledge. We're born with a little bit of knowledge. It's just genetically in us. It's kind of genetically programmed. So I think those all three are certainly sources of our knowledge. So again, the empiricists, to say it, they believe the only kind of knowledge is a posteriori knowledge. The rationalists believe that we have both a posteriori knowledge and also a priori, that we have some knowledge before we have experience. Does that make sense? So look at, we just covered in a few minutes something really very complicated. So just think about our next test. What terms do you think you're going to need to know? Empiricism, rationalism, a priori, and a posteriori. By the way, the words a priori and a posteriori, just as an educated person, you should really know those words because educated people know it. And they actually come up a lot. So for example, we talk about science, people will say science is totally a posteriori because science is totally dependent on our experiences. Science goes and we use our senses and we look at the world and we try to figure out what are the natural laws, how does the world actually work. So science is totally a posteriori. So sometimes you'll hear people actually say that science is totally a posteriori. It doesn't mean it rejects necessarily a priori knowledge, but it's dealing in the realm of what we can discover through our senses. Do you guys feel like you understand that? Do you have a kind of good feel the difference? Okay. All right, so I covered a lot in about 5 minutes or whatever it was, pretty quickly. Okay. I want to talk today we're talking about David Hume. You may remember the first day of class I rated, the greatest philosophers, and I had David Hume as the third greatest philosopher to ever live, right above Kant, who I put fourth. I had Nietzsche first and Sartre second. We've already studied them. David Hume wrote about a lot of different things, and was clearly a very bright guy, to say the least. He did live at the same time that Kant lived, but he was a little bit older than Kant. He lived from 1711 to 1776. In fact, Kant actually read Hume, and he said that Hume woke him up from his dogmatic slumber. So he was giving Hume credit with making him think about things he hadn't thought about. Now, I think they disagreed about an awful lot. So I don't know if he woke him up and that he agreed with the things Hume was saying, or he disagreed, but at least it woke him up. In 1748, he wrote a book called An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. It's a very big book, and it's one of the great books of philosophy. And his position is that everything that one knows about the world ultimately is derived from the senses, or starts from the senses. So he is what? According to that, what is he? He's an empiricist. So he's one of the two most famous empiricists. The other one is John Locke. So some of you may have heard of Locke. He's also from England. Hume is actually Scottish, but he's from Great Britain. And Locke, we modeled our Constitution off of Locke's ideas, so very influential for us. We're not studying Locke in this class, but he was very, very influential. They are the two most famous empiricists in, I guess we call philosophical history. They thought that all knowledge starts with experience. Now, Hume talks a lot about, I wrote it in this, he talks a lot about cause and effect. And this is going to be very important for his philosophy. By the way, when we talk about religion, we're going to again revisit some of Hume's ideas, even though we won't get to, I don't think we don't have any readings from Hume, but we're going to revisit some of his ideas because he did write about religion. And what Hume notices is that our senses rely on concluding there's a cause and effect of things. But he's going to argue we have to be very careful about our conclusions regarding cause and effect. And we need to be very careful in our conclusions that the future will be like the past. And so that's kind of what we're going to be dealing with today. So first I want to talk a little bit about the cause and effect, and then we're going to really be dealing the rest of the day with the very famous problem of induction that Hume notices. So let's talk about cause and effect. So what Hume says is we don't actually ever see cause and effect. So in a sense we can't be sure of cause and effect. What we actually see is two things constantly conjoined. I think I wrote it here, constantly conjoined. And that's in your reading. Two things, what does that mean, constantly conjoined? Well, we see them kind of happening at the same time. And then we make conclusions, oftentimes, that one of them caused the other. So let's just think of an example. So I take my hands and I put them together with sufficient force, and what do we say? My hands coming together with sufficient force produced the sound. So the cause was my hands coming together, and the effect was the sound, right? Okay, so can you do me a favor? I want you to clap, I'm clapping. Will you do it with me? Yeah. Okay, so do it with me. Come on, do it with me, do it with me, do it with me. Okay, the last time I didn't do it. Did you notice that? But you heard a sound, and you might conclude it was me who did it, but it was actually him. Now, you guys knew I told him to do it, but if you didn't actually know it, you could have made a mistake, right? You could have heard the sound and thought, oh, it was Professor Firestone, but it was really you, right? So it's actually pretty easy to make mistakes about cause and effect. And in fact, that's why science and medicine make a lot of mistakes, because they see things constantly conjoined, and they make mistakes. So let's give a few examples so we can really get this, okay? So I'm going to take a really easy example. You know how some players are superstitious? So I'll give you actually a good example. I wrote one down, wearing a blue tie and then winning, but I remember, who knows who Jerry West was? All right, a few of you, thank God, but it shows my age. Jerry West was one of the greatest basketball players to ever live. He played for the Los Angeles Lakers. I mean, and he also coached he coached the Lakers, and he was general manager also he worked for the Golden State Warriors and helped, he was their advisor, helped lead them to a championship. So anyway, great basketball mind. Well, you may or may not know the Lakers have the longest winning streak in NBA history. They won, 30-something games in a row. Do you guys know about that? And so during the win streak, Jerry West wouldn't change his shoes. Now, they probably were getting very worn out by the 32nd game and all that, right? But he wouldn't change his shoes. Why? He was superstitious. Now, in a sense, he's saying, my shoes are causing us to win. Now, was it really the shoes causing him to win? No. But the two things were coming together. He'd wear the shoes and he'd win. We call that correlation without causation. There's a lot of correlations where things come together in time. That's what Hume calls constantly conjoined. And we actually have a fallacy we call post hoc in critical thinking. Same thing. Just because one thing comes before another doesn't mean the first caused the second. So it's actually a fallacy. We have to be careful of. So again, we see this in superstition all the time. You're wearing your blue tie, you're winning, so you keep, wearing the tie. But it comes up again in science a lot, where science makes mistakes. So let's give an example. So somebody. So they say, look, take this diet pill and you'll lose weight. But we're also going to put you on a whole program. And you're going to be eating healthier and eating less and exercising more. And then you lose weight. Now, did the diet pill help? We have no idea. Because you're doing other things that would help you lose weight. And the diet pill may be totally irrelevant. So do we see you taking the diet pill and you're losing weight? Yes. Are these constantly conjoined in our experience? Yes. Is there a correlation? Yes. Is there a causation? Probably not. Probably no causation. By the way, they've done a bunch of studies. As of now, there isn't really any diet pill that we know of that can cause you to lose weight, even though they advertise them on TV all the time, unless it's dangerous. Now, there was that one, what was it called, Fen or whatever it was, that gave you like nonstop diarrhea. You will lose weight, but it was also killing people. You don't want that one, right? You don't want to die to lose weight. I mean, that will lose you weight if you die. But that's not the way to go, I think. But there isn't any healthy way to take a pill that we know of yet. Maybe they'll come up with it, but we don't do it. So anyway, so science a lot of times makes mistakes because it does find these correlations, but it's not always a causation. You have to rule out all other possible causes. Now, sometimes people exploit this idea that correlation doesn't mean causation. So I'm going to give you a couple examples. So the cigarette companies said it's true that a lot of people who smoke are getting lung cancer. But it doesn't prove that smoking is causing lung cancer. Why? Well, maybe the people that smoke also do something else that's dangerous that actually gives them the lung cancer. Well, they're actually right that it would be possible, except for when they ruled everything else out, what did they figure out? It was really the cigarettes. Let me give you one more example. We've talked about global warming. So what do the people trying to deny global warming say? They say, well, some of them say, well, it's true that we're polluting the earth. And it's also true the earth is getting warmer. But that doesn't prove, although we see these two things constantly conjoin, that the pollution is causing the earth to get warmer. There could be another cause. For example, some people said maybe sunspots, flare-ups on the sun, are actually, we do know they affect weather patterns, maybe they're causing the earth to get warmer. Or maybe it's something in the interior of the earth that we don't know about that's causing the earth to get warmer. Well, scientists then actually had to go look at the sunspots and try to figure it out. They actually concluded, no, that doesn't seem to be making us get warmer right now. There's not any unusual activity going on in the sun right in the last 20 years. And so they kind of ruled that out. So we're left with, it's due to our pollution. It looks like they've tried to rule everything else out. They think they've done it. But you see, just because two things are constantly conjoined, or we can say correlated, doesn't mean one caused the other. That you have to kind of rule out all other possibilities before you can make that conclusion. So Hume kind of warns us about that, and I think it was a proper warning. And when I first read Hume, I didn't really make a big deal of that. And now that I've been teaching critical thinking for a number of years, it kind of dawns on me. I go, you know what? He's really making a really important point that escaped me about causation, that it's very easy to make mistakes about causation. And it turns out, especially when it comes to medicines, it's really easy to make mistakes about it. When you talk about the human body, we put so many things into our human body, it's hard to make sure that we control for all variables when we're making conclusions about this pill works and this pill doesn't, or this medicine works and this one doesn't. So I think he makes a really good point. Okay, any questions about, does it make sense to you guys about the cause and effect and constantly conjoined? All right, let's go to the next point before we get into the big issue of the problem of induction. Let me take a little coffee here, make sure I'm awake. It was this class, I got dizzy last time, right? That was the weirdest thing. Have you ever gotten dizzy where you guys were starting to rock and like, I mean, it was like, I have no idea. I've been almost sick, so I don't know what caused that, but I have a request, you guys don't move. All right, anyway. Okay, so let's go to the next thing. So we talked about different kinds of, we talked about one kind of skepticism. What was the kind of skepticism we talked about when we studied Descartes? Who remembers? Methodological skepticism. Remember, let's write that on the board. We talked about methodological skepticism. And what does that mean? Well, skepticism, remember, just means to doubt or to question. So that's what a skeptic does. He doubts or questions. So methodological skepticism is doubting as a method, not because you really doubt, but you're trying to learn something. What was Descartes trying to learn? He was trying to learn what he could be absolutely certain of. And so he even doubted that there was a world out there, and his senses put him in touch with the world. It's not that he really didn't think there was a world out there, but he was saying, what can I be absolutely certain? And he actually doubted because he says, well, I know that my senses, make mistakes sometimes, so I can't really trust them. So that was a method, using skepticism as a method. Another kind of skepticism is just, we call it just common sense skepticism. And I hope all of us have that. And that's just to really say, you're common sense and you doubt some things. You don't believe everything you hear. That you know that people exaggerate, that people lie, right? You shouldn't believe the car salesman, that this is really the best deal, things like that, right? So we should all have common sense skepticism. Well, Hume is famous for another type of skepticism, and it's usually called Hume's limited or mitigated skepticism. To mitigate just means to lessen, so it's like limited, to lessen. So Hume's limited or mitigated skepticism. So what is that view? That view is we cannot, when we're talking about knowledge, we cannot achieve certainty. That's his view. We can't really be absolutely certain of the things we believe. We can only achieve probability regarding knowledge. So that's his view. We can't really be certain. It's a little bit like Descartes, right? We can't really be certain about much. We only get probability. Therefore, we should take knowledge claims with a grain of salt. Well, what is it? That's a saying. You guys ever heard the saying, take it with a grain of salt? All that means is realize you may be wrong. I take it with a grain of salt. It may be right, it may be wrong. So you can believe something, you can even believe it strongly, but when Hume is saying, always be open to, you could be wrong. Be open to looking at the evidence. Be open to, the evidence may lead you in a different direction. And really, I think that's what any educated person should, this is the way we should be anyway. That's certainly the philosophical way. You can be confident in views, you can feel strongly in your views, but you're always open to look at the world differently. I can say, since I've been teaching ethics, I actually have changed my view on a few ethical issues. And the reason being is I got to really read what very thoughtful people thought on some issues, on some things I hadn't really thought that much about, and I ended up changing my views on them. And I think that's a good thing, because I always say, if you never change any of your views, then you kind of just stop thinking. I mean, that's just not a good place to be, I think. That's the way some people are. They're very stubborn, right? That's what they grew up with. That's what they believe. They never change. But Hume does says, look, so if we can't be sure, what should we believe? He says, well, accept what is reasonable and useful, but always keep an open mind. Keep an open mind, but accept what's reasonable and useful. Well, so far, I think so good. Hopefully, that's the way we all act already. And when we see other people being stubborn and not being open to follow the evidence, I would assume sometimes you tell them they're being stubborn or whatever, right? Get frustrated talking to those kinds of people. So we all want to be like that. But then he goes a little bit farther. And he says we should not engage in metaphysical, sometimes he calls it theological, or religious speculations, such as whether God exists or we have an eternal soul. Well, why shouldn't we engage in it? Well, because he thinks we really can't get any evidence of it. It's beyond our ability to get evidence of, and we don't need to have metaphysical views. Now, we do probably need to make moral decisions at times. We have to have moral views. So even though we kind of talked about this in this class, we can't really be absolutely sure our moral views are right, or in some sense, maybe there's not an absolute right of morality. There's our views for our reasons, and they might be good reasons, right? But it's hard, we talk about moral objectivism versus moral relativism. Maybe we can be sure of some views, like slavery is wrong, but not others. Other views are probably morally relative. Remember we talked about the abortion issue, something like that. But we have to kind of have moral views, and you realize that. Sometimes you have to make a moral decision, right? A woman gets pregnant, she has to decide, does she think it's moral or immoral, right, to have an abortion? That's one of the things she's going to have to deal with right then. But when it comes to metaphysical views, you actually don't have to have any. You don't have to actually ever decide, is there a God, or is your soul last forever? You could decide, you could make a decision on that, but you don't have to. You suggest you don't even really think about it. You just focus on this life. Why? It's something you really cannot know. Now, he's very famous. I want to actually read you this quote from him. This is a little bit jarring, And I'm almost shocked at this, that he wrote this, because, Hume was, we're pretty sure he was an atheist, so there is some debate about that, okay? But he wrote a book that's a dialogue among three people on religion, and he basically looks at the big arguments for God, and he kind of shows how they don't hold up very well in the dialogue. But he made sure that got released after he died, so he wouldn't get in trouble. Because in the 1700s, you can't be denying there's God, and, get tarred and feathered. It's not, not a good thing. So he made sure that book got released after he died. But he did write this when he was still alive, and it got published. So he says, when we run over libraries, he means run over two libraries, persuaded of these principles, what havoc must we make? If we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance, divinity, school metaphysics or divinity, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. Ooh. What's he saying? Any books about religion? Burn them. Well, I don't think he meant literally burn them, but he's making a point, right? His point is, we can't really be sure about it. It's not like mathematics, you can just add it up. Experience can't show you whether there's a God, or we'd all agree there's a God because we have the same basic senses. And so his point is that we really shouldn't even waste time thinking about metaphysical things, whether they exist. Now, of course, this is one of the great ironies, I think. Hume tells us, don't even waste time in your life thinking about these things. But remember, he writes a book on it that gets published after he dies, which means he kept thinking about it. So he told us, don't think about them, and then he writes a book, because he kept thinking about it. You guys notice the irony there? I guess he figures he's thought about it for us. We don't have to waste any more time. I don't know what to even think about it, but it's kind of one of those funny things. Don't think about it, but I'm going to keep thinking about it. Okay. You guys kind of understand where he's coming from? Where he's coming from? Okay. Let's get to the problem of induction. So, first of all, this oftentimes by people gets written wrong. They actually state it wrongly. So I want to say there's different ways to state it, but we can say what is the problem of induction? So this is what Hume said. He's asking the question: what justifies our belief that what is held true of observed cases will also be true of unobserved cases? What justifies our belief that what is held true of observed cases will also be true of unobserved cases? We dealt with this when we did the epistemology questionnaire. Remember, we dealt with the statement, all men are mortal? And so what are we saying? In a sense, are you justified that all people will die when you haven't observed all people? You've only observed some people. So that's what this question is. There's a lot of unobserved cases, people you've never met, right, in different parts of the world. What justifies you in concluding that they will die when they get old, just like old people die that you've been exposed to? You guys kind of get the question? So they're saying, now you should notice, I put justifies in quote marks. You guys notice that? And the reason being, and we're going to have to do some more work on it, it's a tricky way he's using it. It's maybe not the way you and I would use the word. What justifies? In a sense what he's saying is there sufficient evidence so that we can feel confident or certain about our belief? So he's saying, can we feel confident or certain in our beliefs that what is held true of the things we've observed is also going to be true of the things that look similar, but we haven't observed, right? Right? What evidence is there to give us great confidence? Is there sufficient evidence for that kind of conclusion? Now, what a lot of people say the problem of induction is the following. where I put subset. It's actually an example of the problem from induction, but it's not, it doesn't encompass the whole thing. We could say, are we justified in believing that the future will be like the past? So when people say the problem of induction, a lot of times that's what they say, but really, this is just an example of the first, of what I just read. Because the future are the unobserved cases. The past are the observed cases. So it's really just the same exact question. The question is, can we be confident that the things we haven't observed that seem to be similar will also react similarly to the things that we have observed? And of course, that also applies to the future and the past. Can we be confident that the future will be like the past? We can just think of an example. Are we justified, let's just say it this way, not just confident, we need to use his terms. Are we justified in believing that the sun will rise tomorrow? It's risen every other day of our lives, right? So we're saying, well, we haven't observed tomorrow yet, right? That's an unobserved cases. Are we justified in believing the sun will rise tomorrow? That's what we're gonna work on today. But we're gonna start with your reading before we get there. We'll kind of work our way up to it. We're gonna see his empiricism first. You guys understand the problem of induction? So you understand what we're dealing with? Right there.
Did you say that in the end?
I won't get the answer. We're gonna work on it. So we'll see. Okay. So he starts off, I think this is in your reading, he starts off talking about the origin of ideas. Where do we get our ideas? And he breaks it into perceptions or sensations. That's one area. And the other way we get ideas is memory or anticipation of the sensation. And perceptions or sensations we could call impressions, and memory or anticipation of the sensation we can call thoughts. I'm not going to actually test you on that right there, but I mean that's just kind of to me muddled. But he says the most lively thought is inferior to the dullest sensation. So let's try to see if we can get what he's saying. You can think about being angry, or you can really be angry. Which one is just more lively? Really being angry. Now, of course, you can think about being angry, I guess, and then get angry, but now you're really angry, right? You're not just thinking about it. So he's pointing out we can think about things, or we can really, be doing them. Then he says, though our thoughts are creative, the creativity is limited to compounding, transposing, adding, or subtracting what we experience through the senses. Our imagination is just creative use of what we've experienced. Okay, so let's just take an example. So let's just think of a mermaid. So a mermaid is supposedly half woman, half fish, right? Now, is there such a thing really as a mermaid? Well, let's assume probably not, okay? We've never found one yet, okay? All right, so assuming that there isn't one, well then if we haven't experienced a mermaid, how can we think about a mermaid? What does he say? He says it still starts with experience. We've experienced women, we've experienced fish, so we can kind of put the two together, and we got a fish woman, or a woman who's fishing, I don't know. So we can so we do this all the time. We think about artists, even kind of New Age art, or this modern art, abstract art. You got a bunch of weird shapes, but they're still putting shapes together that we've all experienced. They're just doing it in a creative way. So again, this is his empiricism. You guys see, it all starts with experience. Of course, we can go beyond our experience. We can apply our reason beyond our experience to create art beyond things we've directly experienced that don't even exist, but it still started with experience. That's how we got the ideas of how to be creative. Our creativity acts upon the world we've already experienced. It acts upon what we've experienced. He says all thoughts arise from simple ideas we have due to a feeling or sentiment we have experienced. And then he says a blind man has no notion of colors, and a deaf man has no notion of sounds. If you think about it, I think that's got to be right. If you never saw a color, we could describe it to someone. Could they really know what it would be like if you were blind from birth? No. And if you were deaf and couldn't hear anything, how could you know what it would be? So again, that's just as empiricism. It's everything we know starts with experience. Okay. Then we go to another section of his book, Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. And he says, there's two main objects of human reason. He says there's relations of ideas and matters of fact. And relations of ideas, he says, are things like geometry, algebra, and arithmetic. And today, we call those analytic, that they're definitionally true by definition. Math is just true by definition. At least that's what some people think. But there's also matter of facts about the world. And those are sometimes called synthetic by philosophers. Well, he says relations of ideas, such as math, are discoverable by thought without dependence on what is anywhere existent in the world. So, for example, there's no perfect circles in nature, but there are truths regarding the circles, right? We talked about that. He says the contrary of every matter of fact is possible. It's not contradictory to think the sun will not rise tomorrow. Think about that. We can be confident the sun will rise tomorrow, but you don't get any contradiction in thinking if it didn't rise. Now, he then asks, what evidence do we have of the existence of matters of fact about the world beyond our senses and our memories of our senses? He says we go beyond what we immediately experience due to assuming cause and effect. Right? We see experiences and then we assume or conclude one thing caused another. Again, how does it work? He gives the example. I believe John is in France. Why? He told me he was going there. I don't actually see him there, but I do it based on my experience of him telling me. Or, I find a watch in a deserted island. What would you conclude from that? Well, it might be deserted, might not, but at least somebody was there at some point, right, and dropped the watch, because watches don't, as I say, watches don't grow on trees. They're not part of nature, right? So you didn't experience a person there, but you're able, by your reasoning ability, to conclude you have experienced that watches aren't natural in nature, and that somebody would have had it made a watch, and somebody would have had to drop it there, right? So we go beyond our experience. But again, here we're just in category 2. He's still an empiricist. He thinks we apply our reasoning ability to what we've experienced to draw conclusions beyond our immediate experience. He says we infer facts from other facts we know, we infer effects from causes. How do we know of cause and effect? Again, we're reviewing from the experience of seeing two things constantly conjoined with each other. Then he says, if you see an object that you've never seen before, and it doesn't resemble anything that you know, you will not know its causes and effects. You need to have experience regarding its causes and effects or something like it, or you're just not going to know. And he gives an example. You guys remember the example he gives? It's in your reading. Remember he gives the example of the billiard ball? So you guys ever pool, right? You guys ever shoot pool? So he gives the example of the billiard ball. And he says, look, if you didn't have any experience of what happens to two objects when they hit each other, you'd have no idea what would happen when one billiard ball hit the other. For all you know, they could hit each other and just stop. Or they could hit each other and one could fly in the air. You would have no idea what would happen. But you do have an idea. Why? Because you've seen objects hit it before. But I mean, you can even think about that. I remember when I watched pool on television. They used to have a lot of pool tournaments on television when I was younger. They don't seem to be on television anymore. And I remember the first time I saw somebody shoot the white ball, right? And it hit another ball and then come back because he had the special spin to make it come back. And I went, wow, I never knew you could do that. Because I couldn't do it. I never saw it before. I had no experience. Anybody here shoot pool? Are you guys, anybody good at it? I mean, isn't it kind of amazing they can do that? I was pretty good at shooting without the fancy spins. I could get the ball in, but to actually shoot it so it goes right back, I mean, I go, holy mackerel, I had never had experience of that. So it's kind of like, right, I mean, you have to have some experience, so you just aren't gonna be able to know what the effects will be from any given cause. Okay. Then he continues, and he summarizes what he's done so far. He says, what is our knowledge of the world based on? He says, cause and effect. Then he says, what is our knowledge of cause and effect based on? He says, well, based on experience. We see two things constantly conjoined. And then he says, what is the foundation of all conclusions from experience? He says, it's not reason. You see a piece of bread, but you would not know it is nourishing to the body without experience. All we see is an object with color, weight, and smell. Okay, so we can actually think about this. Little kids, do they basically put almost everything into their mouth? Everything. I have a 4-year-old, so I can tell you. I mean, I don't know how somebody survived childhood, because they're really putting all these dangerous things in their mouth. If you take a little kid to the beach, what do they almost always do? They put the sand in their mouth. Well, if they put too much, they're gonna die. I mean, they'll smother, right? They won't be able to breathe. So you gotta really watch them. So I think it makes sense. I mean, they have to learn that only certain things are okay to go into their mouth. Moreover, when we see a piece of bread, we assume it will nourish us because we assume that like or similar sensible qualities have like secret powers. What's he talking about? What are the secret powers of the bread he's talking about? Nutrition, right? I mean, how would you know? You put something in your mouth, all of a sudden you get energy and you get nutrition. It's like a secret power. I mean, now we kind of explain it, right? You can imagine even in the 1700s of Hume, I mean, he knew it, but I mean, it's like a secret power. How does this work? You put stuff in your body and you get energy. Okay, how would you know it without experience? You have to put it in your mouth. He says, but why should we feel certain that this appearance of the bread is really bread and is really nourishing? So let's just think about it. You've all had bread before, right? You buy a new loaf of bread at the store. So Hume is saying, why should you feel certain that this new bread is really bread and will be nourishing? Past experience tells us only about the past, not the present or future. It tells us only that in the past, something that looked similar to this piece of bread was nourishing. All right, let's give an example of this. I have to embarrass myself here. You guys know all these plastic flowers I have now? These are one of my big pet peeves in the world. I think flowers are beautiful things. They look beautiful, they smell beautiful. I don't think there should be plastic flowers. I do not allow them in my house. Who has plastic flowers in their house? Get rid of them, quick. All right, but anyway. So have you ever gone to smell a plastic flower because you thought it was real? Who's ever done that? A few of you, not all of you? All right, well, I've done it. It's quite embarrassing and also quite disappointing. You go, oh, look at this beautiful flower. And you can tell it's plastic. You go, holy mackerel. Sometimes I even go feel it just to make sure. It's like quite depressing. Well, I made a little mistake, right? It looked like a flower. What justified in me thinking this was really a flower? It sure looked like the other flowers I saw. So that's what Hume's asking. What am I justified to believe that this new thing, even though it looks similar, was really a flower? What allows us to infer the future will be like the past, or the two pieces of bread will each cause the effect of nourishment just because one piece of bread in the past has done so? So that's actually the problem of induction. Let's go read it the way Hume actually says it. Let's turn to page 74 of our book. So we're at the bottom of the first column, and we're going to read on to the second column. He says, as to past experience, it can be allowed to give direct and certain information of those precise objects only, and that precise period of time, which fell under its cognizance. But why this experience should be extended to future times and to other objects, which for aught we know, may be only in appearance similar, this is the main question in which I would insist. That's the problem of induction. You have two pieces of bread. You eat one. Are you justified in believing the other one is also a piece of bread and will give you nourishment? Because nourishment of this piece of bread has to do with future times, and this is a different object than the first one, isn't it? And Hume is asking, what allows you? Let's read. As to past experience, it can be allowed to give direct and certain information of those precise objects only, and that precise period of time, which fell under its cognizance. But why this experience should be extended to future times and to other objects, which for aught we know, may be only in appearance similar, this is the main question on which I would insist. That's the problem of induction. Let's make sure we get this. A piece of bread has nourished me in the past. I infer to the present and future that this thing before me is also a piece of bread and will also nourish me like past pieces of bread have done. What justifies this inference? What's Hume's answer? What justifies this inference? What? Our experience. No. Because your experience can only tell you about the past. It may be true that every piece of bread in the past has nourished you. But how do we know the future will be like the past? You only know about the experience can only tell you about the past. Look, sometimes don't things totally change in the future? Here you are happily married and one day you come home and your wife's gone. Well, the future hasn't been like the past. She ran off with the mailman. I knew I didn't like that mailman. All right, anyway. This is not a personal experience. That's why I'm laughing. It's not. All right, let's make sure we're talking. This is not me. Right? What? Just, you say it's experience, but it's not experience. Experience can only tell you about what? The past. I'm saying, what justified me is, you say, okay, but wait a second. In the past, before I ate a new piece of bread, before I ate it, I thought, well, past pieces of bread nourish me, so the new piece of bread would, and then I ate it and it really did. So it shows you I can rely on experience. No, you can't. It worked that time, but maybe in the future everything will be different. Experience can only tell you about the past. He wants to know what justifies your belief that something now or in the future will behave like things in the past. That this is really a piece of bread and will really give you nourishment. What justifies that belief according to Hume?
Our customs?
Our customs. No, your customs can lead you astray. You're not justified in relying on customs.
Nothing?
Nothing is the right answer. You get an A for the day. You are not justified. It's a trick question, isn't it? He says, I want to know, what justifies it? What's his answer? Nothing. What could justify it? Look at, reason can't justify it. You don't get a contradiction in your reason if the future is different or if this piece of bread doesn't nourish you. It doesn't contradict reason. And the experience, think about it. How else can you know? Experience can't tell you because experience can only tell you about the past. So his conclusion is, you're not really justified. You can have all the evidence about the past, but it doesn't tell you anything about the future. Because an object that looks like one we've seen before may be attended with different effects. This bread may not nourish us as other bread has. Look, we can think of another example. Who's ever eaten any kind of berry before, right? you've eaten berry and it's very nourishing and it's very tasty. And now you're out and you're hiking somewhere and you eat a berry and what happens? It's poisonous and you die. What justified you in thinking that berry was going to be nutritious? What would Hume say? Nothing. You made a big boo-boo. You should have listened to Hume. You're dead. We can't demonstrate the future by use of the past. At least we can't do so with certainty. The past can at best only tell us, he says, what's probable in the future, not what's certain. But I think Hume puts himself in trouble. Because what Hume concludes is that at best our knowledge can only be probable. It can't be certain because we rely upon experience, but experience only tells us about the past. But I don't know where he gets probability. Because if we really take him seriously, how can we even say it's probable that this piece of bread will nourish us and the future will be like the past? Because that's still assuming that the past is a good guide for the future. But we already know, by the way, from experience, that the future is not always like the past. And the only thing the past can tell us about is the past. Let me make it very clear. You can say, all right, look, I feel 99.99999% certain the sun will rise tomorrow. Why? Well, based on the past. But remember, one day you're going to be wrong. One day, if we believe science, the sun will get bigger and the earth will fry and, there's no sun coming up for us because there's no us, right? And so the sun is not going to be coming up for us, right? And so that day, you say, well, it's 99% justified. I go, no, you were 0% justified. It wasn't coming up. If you understood science enough, you would have known it. You just didn't know it. You relied on the past. So he says knowledge is best only probable, but I think he puts himself in trouble even with the probable. Because if experience only tells you about the past, how can anything in the future you feel very confident about? All right, let's do a little more work on this. Some of you may not realize, but this is actually a challenge to science. Because how does science work? Science works as they test things based on past observations. They make predictions about the future, and if the future comes true, then they say, see, we were right. And Hume is saying, you got to be a little careful even with that. Maybe you're getting the probability, but you still can't be sure. Let's say it a different way. We see the world works a certain way, and we conclude that there are laws of nature. The laws of nature, we call them laws because they always work this way. Science tells us there are universal laws. And then we use those laws to make predictions based on those laws, right? And law means there's no exceptions. That's why we call it laws. But we can never be sure that there are no exceptions. We can only know about how the things we've experienced behave and act, not about the behavior of unobserved or non-experienced things. Look, we can even think about this in science. Science comes up with the natural laws, and they say, well, this is the way it works throughout the universe, and guess what they found out? At the subatomic or quantum level, those laws break down and they don't apply. Isn't that what they found out? Guys take science. Isn't that what they found out?
Yes.
That at least the laws that work for the world we observe don't seem to work at the subatomic level. We might say they weren't justified just based on what they've observed to make a conclusion about all these things they hadn't yet observed. There is always the possibility that the laws will not apply to certain things or in specific situations or in the future. So science bases its predictions on the past and what was experienced and observed, but any predictions about unobserved or future cases is on unfirm footing. Therefore, science, which bases its conclusions on experience, according to Hume, in some sense, is not justified. You guys get this? But we have to really make sure we understand what he means by justified. And that's, again, we're going to go back to this. In some sense, what is he saying? When we're talking about the future unobserved cases, in a sense, we never have sufficient evidence because we only have evidence about the past and observed cases. It's always insufficient to really we can certainly never achieve certainty, can we? So this is what's kind of interesting. In some sense, we're not justified in believing unobserved cases will be like the observed ones and the future will be like the past. But it still is arguably reasonable to do so. So we need to actually draw a distinction. We usually mean justified to mean reasonable, but that's not the way we're using it here. He's kind of using justified to mean certain. Of course we can't be certain about the future unobserved cases. But we can be pretty sure, and that it seems like it's reasonable. It seems that science's predictions are highly probable. But science has no way to ensure that the future will be like the past. So even though they look highly probable, it really can't be sure. In fact, in a sense, science can't prove that its predictions are probable, even though I think that they are really usually probable. You guys kind of get that? Because it always has to assume that the future will be like the past, and the unobserved cases will be like the observed cases. Now I want to say something else. Hume in other writings, it becomes very clear that he believes in the universal natural laws. In fact, he makes a very important argument against the belief in miracles based on the fact that there are universal natural laws. So it's interesting. He does believe in the universal natural laws. The only thing he's doing is cautioning us. He does seem to be right about justification, but not about reasonableness. Our belief that unobserved cases will be like observed cases is not justified, as I said, but it does seem to be reasonable. It's not justified because it can never be sufficiently supported by evidence to give us supreme confidence, because we know things can be different, right? About the future or unobserved cases. But it is reasonable to believe the future will be like the past and unobserved cases will be like similar observed cases, because we have good reasons and evidence to conclude the future will be like the past, because it keeps happening that the future is like the past, and observed cases and unobserved cases behave similarly. So this is the real key for the point we're making here. Justified here doesn't mean reasonable. Hume would agree that it's reasonable to believe that the future will be like the past and unobserved cases will behave like observed cases when the two things look identical or similar. But what he's just cautioning us is to be careful about this. So it's reasonable to conclude that things similar to X will behave like X based on many past examples of how X's have behaved, whatever X is. The more experiences we have, the more observed cases we've looked at, the more reasonable it seems to me to believe similar unobserved cases will act similarly as the ones we've observed. But although reasonable, we're still not justified in believing so, because the evidence can never be sufficient for us, because the future and the unobserved cases may behave differently. So we're using justified in a funny way. It's like certainty here. It's not like reasonableness. You guys kind of see that? We're using it in a kind of a funny way. So what is really the key? Where does this leave us? I think it leaves us where we started earlier today, with Hume's limited or mitigated skepticism. That we can't really achieve certainty about the things we're observing now, right? Because we always make conclusions based on the past, based on our experience. But we can reach, it seems, very high probability about a lot of things. And what does it mean? We should be a little more humble in our views. We should realize we could be wrong, take things with a grain of salt. We kind of end up where we started. It's not that we can't be confident in our beliefs, but we can't be supremely confident. We can't be sure. We can't be sure about unobserved cases and about the future. And because of that, we have to be a little bit careful about our beliefs. All right, let me read, I have my conclusion here. So if we have a lot of experiences about something, we're not justified in making conclusions about similar unobserved cases of the future, but it may be reasonable to make the same conclusions. So how do we apply this to science? Science has proven itself, it seems to me, time and time again. It's practical, useful, and successful. So it is rational and reasonable to use science's methods and science's conclusions. But in the same token, we need to realize science could be wrong as to unobserved cases and as to the future. So science should be accepted provisionally and with a grain of salt. And that is why science itself always looks for better theories and explanations. That's one of the great things about science. They realize that, and they're always accept things provisionally. If we kind of think about it, if we look at how science works, it kind of like we look at the world, and then we had Newton's ideas of how the world worked, and it was pretty good, but it couldn't account for as many things as Einstein could. So we kind of went from a Newtonian view of the world to a Einsteinian, and someday we'll go to even another view probably, right? So it's not that Newton was all wrong, but Newton could not account for some of the unobserved cases that Einstein can account for. Now Einstein himself can't account for, he couldn't unify the subatomic world and the world that they're trying to come up with some way to unify the two, and so we have rules that work in both places, and so far they've been unsuccessful. I don't know if they're going to be successful. But we went to Einstein because we thought he did a better job in being able to give us answers to unobserved cases. Our newer theories better account for more situations. The earlier theories helped us understand the world and function in it, but the later theories do a somewhat better job. Let's just take another example. Let's take it about measles and polio vaccine. So some people have been against taking these vaccines, right? But let's do an analysis. These vaccines have been very effective in the past. Now, could there be bacterial or microbial resistance someday that make them ineffective in the future? I guess it's possible. We don't know for sure. We're not justified to believe for sure they'll work in the future, are we? But will they probably work? Well, it seems like that's reasonable because they've worked in the past and they've continued to work up to the present time. So it'd certainly be reasonable to think they could work in the future. So I'd want to take my vaccines if I were you, because they really do save a lot of lives. Polio, it's pretty much been wiped out for most of the world. It was very prevalent before. Very prevalent. I know people have had polio, but this is for my generation, not in yours. So, so it's reasonable, I think, to rely on the past. But you're not justified because, in a sense, you can never get sufficient evidence to be sure the unobserved cases will work. Does it make sense to you guys? Any questions about what we did today?